everybody, and welcome back to Founders Fail, Lessons Learned. My name is Jose Castillo, and today I am joined by the founder of Podkick, Spencer Shaw. Spencer, thank you so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure. I love what you guys are doing.
Well, this is a really interesting discussion, and I want to start out with a quote and get your reaction on it. It's by Napoleon Hill. He said, "Most great people have achieved their greatest success one step beyond their greatest failure." Do you agree or disagree with that statement?
Yeah, I mean, I probably look at failure a little different than most people. I can see that's pretty accurate.
So what does failure mean to you specifically? If it is different than what you think others, how do you view it differently?
To me, failure is just feedback. Beyond that, like nothing else. Failure would mean that I'm dead and I can't try again.
Yeah.
And so I really don't see any failure out there.
So we'll talk about feedback. I like that word, feedback, as a descriptor for failure. Is that something you actively seek out? Like, do you go, man, I'm looking for feedback, so I'm going to fail? Or is it I'm responding to failure by gathering that data? How do you explain more about feedback? I like that word.
Sure. I think, one, because I look at it that way, I really don't, I'm kind of indifferent. So obviously, having a success or something working the first time is great, but typically if it works the first time, there might not be a lot of longevity to it. And so I want to get feedback as quick as possible. And if I'm failing, then I want to know, why am I failing? And typically, actually not typically, I don't know if I've really started any business where I had the idea and then the success ended up with that idea long term. It was typically go for it, and then what would appear as failure, but a feedback, and say, okay, well, I need to change this or tweak that, go to the next, and it's constantly iterating, and then it becomes a success. Most people would look at that as a failure, and I just say, cool, we evolved as it went along.
So do you have to have failures in order to be a successful founder?
I would say there's probably some circumstances, no, and there's some industries, no. Most situations, yes. And those exceptions would be certain type of specific markets, industries, patents, or whatever that could be. But I mean, if your likelihood getting it the first time, it probably wasn't a good success.
So looking back on your life or business, what is one of your greatest failures?
Oh, that's awesome.
It's an easy question, right?
Yeah.
Just tell me your greatest failure.
So is this like this is like Operation where you just took a scalpel and opened me up?
We're going right for it.
Yes. I can look at it and there's several. One of the first ones that I had in the business world, I ended up creating a company called Lenders Group, and it was a real estate referral network. And what we did is we created partnerships with mortgage companies and banks. And it exploded. Like, we had hundreds and hundreds of real estate agents that were using our service, our product. And so we assembled a board. And then I remember I showed up to the board meeting in the summertime, and I was like 23 years old. And they had already been meeting. I walk into the room and I could sense some tension, and they slid a check across the table and they said, "We've decided to buy you out." And like, everything stopped. My heart, like, it felt like a massive failure. And in a way it was, because I didn't know the rules of the game. And so had I known the rules of the game and smarter, I wouldn't have had that failure, and I could have had a bigger exit, and it wasn't that big. So that was horrible for me. And then I can look at even just a recent failure a couple years ago. I went into an e-commerce business, and we ended up pushing thousands of units, but we couldn't scale. And on paper, I think I lost like $25,000. But it was enough feedback for me to say, okay, well, that wasn't the right marketplace. And there's a few other variables. But it doesn't like prevent me from going into e-commerce more or other businesses. I just look at it and say, okay, cool, I'm not dead. Yeah. Let's keep going.
So those lessons you learned from failure, how do you apply those today when you're making decisions? Do you think back to those? Does it affect how you circumnavigate what you're doing now?
I think at times, maybe if confidence is low, or if I'm with the wrong people or the wrong project, yes. But for most circumstances, no. I just look at it and it's always that feedback piece. And there's probably something subconscious in there where it's like, hey, I know that I need to, if I'm going into a new venture, like I need to know what are the rules in this game. And then I avoid being sidelined or sidestepped. And, if it's on other projects, I just look at it and there's almost innate. You know what I mean? It's hard to explain.
No, I get it. And I think that gets baked in when you have those, like you said, the moment where you're in the board meeting, you're like, I don't want that to happen again. Yeah. So subconsciously, you're always kind of looking out for it. What's the difference between failure and fear of failure?
I would say, that's a really good question. So fear of failure shows up for a lot of people, and I can spot it.
Yeah.
Here's where it shows up. It shows up in people taking way too long to validate their ideas. It shows up if anyone ever comes to me and says, hey, I'll share you this idea, but I need you to sign an NDA. I already know they're pretty much going to fail. If someone shows up and they're like, I've got a really cool idea, I just have to get investors to do it, but they haven't even attempted on the idea, they're going to have failure. It shows up if someone is starting a business and they feel like they have to have a partner in order to do it. That's failure. And that's fear showing up by them saying, I'm not good enough. And so they're doing all of these things instead of actually executing.
That's a great perspective on it. How do you combat fear of failure? Because I think, particularly in this day and age, a lot of us are struggling with fear about what the next step is. From you personally, how do you combat it? How do you recommend other people combat that fear of failure?
If you're not going to die, if you're not going to be permanently injured, if you're not going to be bankrupt, then there's really no downside to that. And if you're not going to lose your integrity. So I'd say worse than dying or being permanently disabled or whatever would be losing your integrity. And then by looking at it that way, there's no failure whatsoever. Like I could start a business and lose a ton of money and realize that was the wrong idea. I'll start another business and it's just money. Like it doesn't matter. I don't know. Like I guess I have just beat up fear so much that there just isn't any.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's great for our viewers as well. Do you have any tips or tricks, anything that you can share with them of maybe one thing they can do right now to start, either failing more or being more comfortable with failure?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a few things to look at, and they're probably counterintuitive. Most of the entrepreneur stories are the highlight reels and the glory stories, and that's not real.
Yep.
So most people I see often with new entrepreneurs or forced entrepreneurs, meaning you got, your job was downsized. They're trying to throw Hail Mary passes all the time. And that may work in some circumstances, in most it's not. So the way you combat it, one, make sure that you have an emergency fund. You've got runway, so you're taken care of. Because what happens is, if you're in a situation where you're thinking about your finances on a day basis, or a weekly basis, or a monthly basis, your brain can't think with an amount of abundance because you're so in the middle of it. You just can't do that. So one, make sure you have some savings set aside. That'll help your mental health, your family's health, everyone else. Two, as you're doing this, get the quick wins and get your business to a sustainable level that allows you to actually do what you need to. And I don't know what that means. Maybe it means that it's throwing off 100,000 profit in a year to you, or whatever that number could be. But as long as you take care of that baseline, now you have the ability to actually focus on things that are more important. And too often, again, people are in the trenches, and I've been in this too, because I've been an entrepreneur for years. You're in the trenches and you're like, oh, if I just have this one break, it feels like the world's against you. And so where that also goes is if there are entrepreneurs that are trying to start out and maybe they're wanting to leave their job and they don't have enough savings, keep your job, get things working on the side until that business throws off enough that it forces you out.
Yep. So. Yeah, cancel Netflix, keep your day job, and sell one thing to one customer.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, thank you so much to Spencer Shaw from Podkick for joining us. We really appreciate it. And everybody out there, share your failure stories with us. founders fail. We would love to hear them. Thank you again, and thank you all, and we'll see you guys next time.